creative process, as I've gotten older, um, I think in a lot of ways the process seems to take longer than it used to. I think in a lot of ways, I know what I'm working on um, far enough in advance that I can kind of start thinking about the problems that I want to solve with a new piece of music, or an issue I want to tackle, or something I feel like I want to say. I can do all of that much uh, earlier on, let's say even up to a few years away from the premiere of the piece, which is its own kind of luxury, because you can start to go through this process that I think everybody does, the creative process of, the kind of, like almost like a Mario Kart collision course of, okay, well, that's the wrong turn, and that was a roadblock, and this is a tire in the middle of the road, and this is a really, wow, okay, now the car is going really fast, and this is a great idea. And you go. So there's a lot of that process that I think happens in every single, whatever the project happens to be. So if sometimes it's a purely musical issue that I'm thinking of, that, okay, I want to write a piece that, in which the horns have this kind of music, and I really want to think about how to write this music for horns. I think that's something I like to think about. I love thinking about how the orchestra being this, I always talk about it as the kind of elephant that you can get to balance on the top of a dime. That it really is such an amazingly facile object, or some people say it's the world's most perfect giant instrument. That it's still one thing, the orchestra, even though there are up to 100 or even more players on the stage at one time. And so there's so much about it that I think I never get tired of thinking about. But in the case of other pieces, I think there's something else I'm trying to do. And so if the point of the piece is something narrative, for example, the piece I wrote for the Cabrillo Festival, which was premiered 2 seasons ago, a piece I wrote called Melt, which was about glacial melt in California, among other places. And, there was something else that was really kind of gurgling up. I had a lot of feelings about, the places that I grew up, or the places I saw as children. This is very different without that glacial melt, without the snow that feeds the ecosystem year round, as the glaciers tend to recede. So I just had something completely different. That led to a lot of different creative, it was just a really different experience for me in writing it, which I really enjoyed. There was certainly something in that music that I wasn't expecting to write, which is always the most exciting thing about the creative process, is that if you can put yourself in a very zen, open place about going where it's taking you. And a lot of that was reading John Muir, and I was doing a lot of research, and so as I say, as I get older, I kind of get deeper into these things, and as opposed to when just write. Let's say I'm going to write a piano etude. I sort of just for the sake of the, if you think of etude, the French word for study, if you think of it as just simply the task of sitting down and writing music, that's one thing. But I think if you have, whatever you want to put it behind it, that it really can change your own attachment to the work you make. And that certainly has affected my creative process. The deadline is looming or has already passed, and that's when I just have to get it done. And that's something that I know many composers who just said, if I never had a deadline, I would never finish. And so, as much as I hate to admit it, and as much as I hate that it's true, it really does motivate me in a way. I feel like you hear these stories about like these old gumshoe journalists that the deadline was Wednesday at 2 p.m. and so they started writing it Wednesday at 1:45 p.m. and they did. This is sort of, there is something about it where you get used to having a certain kind of pressure, and that can be its own kind of motivation. And I hate to say that that's become true for me. I really wish that I would just float out of bed and have my little croissant and then just sit and, create gloriously. But it's usually a really, it's like, pulling tar from a cactus or something. It's just very, it's a very complicated and emotionally draining procedure. And so I think sometimes in a way that things come much more easily to me in terms of how to make something happen than they used to. I think there's this sort of, you have a lot of practice at something. Okay, I have a practice at making some kind of texture with an orchestra. I mean, I never feel, I never feel like I ever want to repeat myself exactly. And sometimes I have that when I'm in the middle of writing something like, I actually almost already wrote this before. So then I try to, I actually fixate on something to make it new or make it kind of interesting for me, because I feel like if I've written, it's almost like, like Bart Simpson when he was having to write the same sentence over and over again on the blackboard. Well, then it just becomes about the writing of the sentence and you forget what you're even writing, And so I always want to keep that, the focus on what's new and what's interesting about the piece. But in general, I would also say a simpler way to think about whether the piece is done or not, for me, is that if, I do really have this way of worrying about the material, but then the actual shape of the building or the shape of the house, that once I get it into brick form, I just lay the bricks down. So I have to say, I don't think I've ever turned in a piece where the end just like didn't happen. But I can always be, tidying up the little perfect corners and stuff like that. So there is a point where you just have to let it go. And if not, then the piece isn't going to get performed. So you have to let it go. There were things that I worked on really, 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 really hard. You could say that was about 10 seconds of music, and it maybe took, a week or something to write. And when it sounds better than you hoped it would, then that's a pretty amazing feeling. Yes, I mean, I definitely can think of some 10-second sections that I wish I hadn't written as well. So I think it's almost like the sort of perfect flourish of the best sentence at the end of the right paragraph. There is that moment where you're like, I think I got this right. But that's the thing about it with music, or certainly with orchestras, you can't quite tell until it's rendered. And so then sometimes what feels so important in the writing of the piece, then in the rendering, it sort of just goes by and I'm like, oh, well, that's fine. And then you somehow have this kind of odd disconnect, because I've also had the opposite thing happen where I write something that is insanely difficult for the orchestra to put together. And they really, really work super, super hard on like this one transition moment. And I think, oh my gosh, I could have just written it. I could have changed these 3 things and it would have been so much simpler for them to execute. As you get older, or as I get, I don't know, hopefully a little wiser, I have fewer of those moments of, I always feel like it's our job as composers to understand the beauty of execution and the amazing kind of synergy that these amazing players really spend their whole life developing. And so, you have, as I say, this amazing kind of skill set that every orchestra members, depending on where they're sitting, you see what the percussionists have to do to, first of all, have 16 mallets in their hands and run from spot to spot and remember where their music is and keep one eye on Christy at all times. That's an amazing physical skill set. And then you have, like the cello section that they have spent their entire life, looking at the side of someone and knowing what the hand gestures and what everything means from the side. And they've never known it from any other from any other way. And so there's so much that's, this literal kinetic energy and understanding how that you can kind of ride that wave as the composer. I think that's, as I say, those are the things that I get so excited about. But then when they, as I say, like in my sort of optimal 10 seconds, I would actually, as I say, like really get to ride that wave, and it'd be something that I worked hard on, and then it's something that they were able to execute easily, but then it sounded really good. Yeah, that's a pretty great 10 seconds of music. I have to think about how often I've done that. In terms of, you know, collaborating with other musicians and musicians of the orchestra, I feel like it's at some point in the middle of this process when I'm writing a piece that I have thought so much more about them than they would ever guess, or that they would ever think about me, right? That it's like this incredibly lopsided thing, because of course, with an orchestra like the Cabrillo Festival Orchestra, I actually really know a lot of those players. I've known some of them from other places, and I knew them before I met them at Cabrillo. Many of them I now know by working with them at the Cabrillo Festival, but I know who they are. I know, you know, I know Michael Shepard, the pianist. I know Justin Bruns, the concertmaster, and I know almost every single person sitting between those two people. And so I think about it, you know, and I think, okay, well, not necessarily trying to guess or gauge, you know, how they would play something or how they would approach it, but just there is something quite visual about especially orchestra. I think if you can think of it, if I put myself in a kind of visualization mode of thinking of the you know, the Santa Cruz Community Center. I can't quite remember the name of the hall, but the, you know, in the on the floor of the stage, and thinking, oh yeah, it could be, you know, there's like this afternoon sun coming in the rehearsal, and you know, the composers are seated there in the front row and everything. That's an atmosphere, and and when you know what you're writing is going to be heard in that atmosphere, it can actually kind of help you along. And then of course, when I've written music for groups that I don't know personally, that's actually, it is harder for me. I find it better when I know, sort of, I feel like a little bit more part of the troupe, as opposed to, you know, the very famous image I always have is of Charlie Kaufman, who wrote himself as a character in Adaptation. And he's this sort of loser who sits to the side, and the actors won't talk to him, even though he wrote the movie. And I think that's like, there's a sort of very anxious person. I think all composers and all creative artists, we have in us that we're not actually part of the process, right? We made this thing and everybody else gets to go do it and have fun with it. But I mean, I find that in reality that never happens. But it's easier for me to, as I say, collaborate, to think about it in a collaborative way. And then in a way, you know, and this is something I feel when I feel especially close to musicians, when I feel like it's like, I made him a little gift. I put a little box, it's a present, and this is for you, and look, you get a little, you know, moment to shine there, or you know, or a little wink there. I've definitely done that a lot where I have written music for this or that player that I know they'll play really well, and so I sort of, and I make it clear, like, this is for you. I had been very convinced I was going to be an architect from about as early as you could be, and understand what an architect did. Something like 4 or 5 years old, someone explained it to me, and I said, okay, that's me. I'm definitely, I'm doing buildings. That's me. And at a certain point, you know, I caught the music bug, and I got, you know, extremely excited about it, and I basically have been ever since. I lived, you know, in middle school and high school, I mean, I lived and breathed it. There was nothing else that I really didn't care about organic chemistry or AP history or any of those things. I really just wanted to be in rehearsals and doing things and writing and performing all the time. But it's so interesting because now I have, you know, friends who are architects, and I always have this sort of like moment of like, well, what would the other side have looked like? You know, what would, these are not my coolest cool glasses, but I think I would still have to up my game if I was going to pursue architecture as a field. That is definitely a requirement, is to have the coolest glasses that of anyone you've ever met.